All right, back to work again, and we're going to have the Q&A. And as I explained this morning, during the roundtable discussions just before lunch, the third session and the fourth session were considered, but as well as that, consideration was given to what matters members would like put on the ballot paper. And what we did was we had a form like this, and the facilitator at each table has filled out the form. So we have it in writing, but we're conscious of the fact that there should be transparency. And for that reason, when I'm dealing with the questions from a particular table, in relation to that particular table, when the question is answered, I'll come back and I'll just say, well, what topics did you raise? What do you want addressed in the ballot paper? So that's in relation to the tables that have questions. And I say it's in the interest of transparency. So we'll start. The mic ladies are still around. So I'll take the first question. Table 11.
Thank you, Judge.
Yeah.
I'm the facilitator for Table 11.
Yes.
And the citizens at this table, there was one question which we would like to put to the panel. Is there a process to establish the source of the funds where an individual is spending a lot of money on a particular campaign?
Not to my knowledge. At the moment, I'm open to correction on that, but because at the moment the requirements which are there are directed towards political parties and what are called third parties, which would be mostly civil society organisations. So they have to engage with very specific disclosure requirements with the Standards and Public Office Commission, but as regards individual spending, there are no legal requirements policing that at the moment, unless I've missed something along the way, but to my knowledge, no.
Mark, is that your view as well?
I'm afraid I'm no expert on that area, but I do know that entities campaigning in a referendum must register with the Referendum Commission as bodies who are campaigning, or some sort of individual random person can't simply spend money on his or her own private campaign. They must register with the Commission as somebody who's campaigning. I'm afraid I'm not familiar enough with the rules on funding to give a view.
Well, that appears to me to be the position, yes. Very good. Then Table 11, what? Sorry? No, go ahead. What do you have any suggestions for the ballot paper?
Thank you, Judge. The citizens at this table had 3 points that they wanted to raise. The first point is not the view of all of the citizens at the table, it's a minority view. The first one is that referenda should be non-binary. They should be in the style of the ballot put to the Assembly for the 8th Amendment.
Right. And you say this is a minority view at the table?
Yes, that's correct.
Yeah.
The second point is that there should be a permanent electoral commission managing all aspects of the electoral process, including management of the registrar of electors.
Yeah.
And the third point is that the Referendum Commission should be more consistent and proactive in correcting inaccurate claims or statements made during campaigns. Thank you, Judge.
Very good. Thank you very much. Where are we? Table 5. Yeah.
Thank you, Judge. I'm the facilitator at Table 5. We just had one question for the panel, which is it possible for the Referendum Commission and Electoral Commission to be one body and then for it to operate permanently?
I think it is. We've never had an Electoral Commission before, but for example, currently the Standards and Public Office Commission, the Ombudsman, the Referendum Commission, the Ethics and Public Office Commission, all operate out of one physical office in Leith Street, which is the office of the Ombudsman. There's interchange between personnel in those organisations. In practical terms, when a Referendum Commission is established, because there's only one established, as your question makes clear, in advance of an individual referendum, a number of staff from the Standards and Public Office Commission or the Ombudsman's Office are seconded across to the Referendum Commission. So in effect, there is perhaps a logical cluster of commissions and bodies there that could form an electoral commission, a standards public office commission, the one that deals with political party funding, the one that deals with gifts to politicians, donations to politicians, and one deal with referendums. People have argued that perhaps the body that revises Dáil constituencies could also sit within that. So, others, the Constitutional Convention in 2013 made recommendations around this, and the Taoiseach has talked about this. So there are proposals out there, and yes, that is one option.
I would just add that other countries do this and do so successfully. So there is a template there.
Yeah, very good. And what about the matters you'd like to see on the ballot paper?
So there was a number of matters raised at this table. So the establishment of a permanent independent electoral commission, which incorporates a referendum commission. Yeah. Secondly, to vote on the banning of the placards and posters that are put up on the polls, to be able to vote at any polling station, to vote on whether a referendum to be held on the same day as the general elections or a by-election, to vote on whether polling days to be held on a weekend day, and then to follow on from that, and whether it'll be over 1 day or 2 days, and we appreciate obviously within legislation at the moment it is for 1 day, to vote on whether the print media to adhere to similar rules as the Broadcasting Act, and then lastly the prohibition of external contributors.
Yeah, very good. And then we have that in writing. Thank you. Any other questions?
Thank you, Judge. The citizens at Table 8 had 4 points, questions they wish to raise. The first is that they feel that timelines for implementation of referenda outcomes should be set, i.e. X number of periods of Parliament. Following from that, they also kind of wanted to bring the point that as a sign of good faith and a means of demonstrating to Irish citizens that referenda results are a core principle of our democracy, the government should immediately act on the decision of the people in the 1979 Shannon representation referenda. The next one was...
And that isn't really, that's a comment rather than a question, is it?
It's, yeah. Well, I think the timelines is I think they feel that timelines ought to be a question within a ballot paper, that they ought to be set. The next is probably both as well, is that there was a consensus that we need to revisit the petitions issue, that if X 100,000 or X thousand petitions citizens sign a particular petition on an issue that the Houses of the Oireachtas, there should be some mechanism whereby they have to formally address it in a fixed time frame, and based on the results of such an investigation, that there may well be grounds then to call a referendum.
Yeah, so that's really the citizens' initiative.
Absolutely.
Point.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then the last one is in relation to social media. The suggestion would be that corporate entities and advocacy groups who use social media channels to push their agendas should be held accountable in the same manner in which they would be if they were using traditional media channels such as radio or television.
Yeah. So again, that's very much a comment as distinct from a question.
Distinct from a question.
Do you want any?
That was
do you want the speakers to make any observations on those?
Is there anybody here? Is there anything that you would like to?
No. Would either of you like to comment on any of those points?
Thank you.
I think some of those issues are being dealt with later on by some of the afternoon speakers, so I think it's probably best to leave them for later on.
There's one point, I suppose, that the issue of holding social media accountable in the same way as traditional media will be held accountable is a huge and worldwide issue. It goes much far beyond referendums here. I mean, there is a constant debate between people who believe they have been defamed and have had their good name taken on social media, and the Facebooks and Twitters of the world put their hands up and say, we didn't say it, we just provide the platform, other people say it, we're not responsible for what people say on our platform. That's a debate and an argument that's going to go on in many countries, I think, over time, whether social media should be held accountable in that way. So yeah, that's the only comment I would make on that.
Yeah. I think most people would agree with you on that. Any other question? Table 6.
Good afternoon, Judge and the panel. I'm the facilitator for Table 6. The citizens here have one comment and 2 questions. Firstly, regarding the comment...
Well, we'll leave the comment until afterwards. Let's do the questions first.
Absolutely. In respect to the question, the citizens were curious What level of frequency can a person make anonymous donations if they're minded to do so?
So there's a limit of €100 in a calendar year, and that's a cumulative aggregate total. So you could make €101 anonymous donations, for example, or in whatever breakdown you want. But the annual total limit is €100 per year.
Yeah.
Is that, how is it monitored?
It must be reported by the body receiving the donation, must report it in its report of donations to the Standards and Public Office Commission.
Can they only receive €100 anonymously?
No, that's per donor.
But how do you know, if it's anonymous, how do you know who the donor is?
Yes, that is a good question. So, so I don't have a quick answer to that question.
That's basically what my thinking on that was, is that if it's anonymous, then there's no paper trail on it.
Yeah.
And can somebody, if they wanted to make a very large donation, break it up into €100 denominations?
I'll double check the detail of the legislation just to double check that point of whether it's all donations or individual donations. I'll double check that and I'll feed that information back to you later on.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Very good. And you had a second question.
Yes, correct.
Yeah.
The second question is regarding a suggestion of public funding allocated to parties and campaigners. Would there be merits, the panel would feel, for an overall cap or threshold so that an aggregate figure of private and public funds should not exceed a certain figure?
Yeah, so that would be if you went for the spending limit option potentially rather than the donation limit. So that would, if you say that each campaign group has a ceiling on what it's entitled to spend, then that has that effect. And as to where that comes from, I mean, that could come from entirely public sources, entirely private sources, or a combination of both.
Yeah.
One point on that, people in referendums often talk about the yes side and no side as if there's a neat campaign on the yes side and a neat campaign on the no side. There often isn't. There are often 2 or 3 groups on one side, each perhaps giving different reasons for wanting to support or oppose a particular referendum. It'd be very difficult to police something like that if one group said, well, actually, we spent all the money, so you two can't spend any. You know what I mean? We're on the yes side. So there would be practical difficulties to that.
Yes.
But they had, I mean, in the UK, they have a system for doing that where they designate a lead campaign group, and then there's umbrella rules attaching to a lead campaign group, and then they have separate rules governing political parties, for example, and so on. So there are international examples of mechanisms that attempt to do that, at least.
Yeah.
Very good. And just in relation to the comment.
Yes, I was just going to ask you that.
Very good. It's more so in relation to the original question. The comment the table wants to put forward, there was a lot of debate regarding transparency, and especially in relation to donations. And I suppose maybe the panel could just maybe provide more information on the pros and cons regarding anonymous donations, because there was a lot of debate among the citizens as to the pros and cons of anonymous donations.
Well, I suppose the question that was asked earlier gets to that issue, that from the perspective of transparency, obviously, if anonymous donations are permitted, then that is far less transparent. So it really goes to that question of how transparent you want the process to be. Do you want to be able to track just how much money groups are raising, or do you also want to be able to track the source of those funds? And so obviously the more rules you put in around tracking the sources, then the more transparent the process will be.
Yeah. Very good. And the duty of disclosure is on the recipient.
Yes, so it's the duty is on the body, be it the political party or be it the civil society organisation, to keep those records and to produce them in their reports to CIPO each year.
Very good. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Any further questions?
Suggestions for the ballot paper?
Oh, your suggestion. Sorry, my apologies.
Thank you, Judge. Just 2 suggestions that the citizens of number 6 wish to bring forward. Number 1, that whatever visual campaigning, such as posters or cable ties, etc., will be used by any campaigners, they should be environmentally friendly. And the second point I wish to raise was that an electoral commission should have power to investigate instances of fake news in relation to campaigning.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Now, table 12. Yeah.
Good morning. I'm the facilitator for Table 12. We have 2 questions. Is it feasible to apply common regulation across all media, including social media? And related to that, how would one actually go about in practice regulating social media? And that would come from all members at the table.
Yeah, yeah.
The short answer is I don't know how you could regulate
Yeah,
social media. In fact, you can't regulate social media in terms of yes and no. And people can go on Twitter and Facebook, whoever they are, and make their case. I imagine in the same-sex marriage referendum, for example, there were much more people on the yes side wanting change on social media than on the no side, which is to do just with the profile of people, I think, who use social media. I don't think you can regulate that, but you can't regulate that.
Yeah,
There are also jurisdictional issues there in that the social media platform may not have any presence in this jurisdiction, which complicates efforts to pass Irish laws governing a social media platform which may have no presence in Ireland. And how do you then enforce that? So it's very challenging.
And finally, I just wonder how important it is. I mean, if there are tens of thousands of people on social media advocating a vote in one particular way or the other, are they really influencing anybody? You know, they are much less influential than a television debate or a radio debate in the evening and so on. Nobody's reading social media really, I think, and looking at the very short messages people are putting up. They tend to be reinforcing each other's views, is my view, rather than really engaging and changing people's minds. If you look at the tone of debate on the Eighth Amendment, for example, on social media, you don't really see anyone changing anyone's mind there. It's very much reinforcing each other's views. Yeah.
Yes, table 7.
My question was the same as a previous table. We felt that by stating that there's a cap of €100 for anonymous donations, each one, you're actually stating that there's no cap on anonymous donations because there'd be no way of tracking them. So we felt that that was a problem. And for the ballot paper, there was a suggestion for a cap on the total spend rather than donations to establish, again, an electoral commission on a permanent basis, and should we consider having a minimum percentage turnout for the referendum in view of the fact that some of the referendums were carried with a 29% only electoral turnout?
Yeah. Thank you very much. Do you want to make any comment on the question, which was repeated? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, and I'm trying to pull up the detail of the legislation here in front of me as we speak. I mean, I'll read out precisely what the section
which section is it?
Says, so this is section 23 of the Electoral Act of 1997.
Yeah.
And what it says, this is the version applying to political parties, and the civil society groups is in a different section, but it says, shall not directly or through any intermediary accept a donation exceeding €100 in value unless the name and address of the person by or on whose behalf the donation is made are known to the party.
Yeah.
So the legislation just says shall not accept a donation over €100 if it is anonymous. Now, as to exactly what that means around the earlier point about tracking whether those ones are coming from the same source or not, essentially that raises the question, how do you enforce that and make it stick? It's very difficult.
Yeah, yeah.
So I guess how you could do that would be to ban anonymous donations outright, rather than imposing this limit, which is there at the moment.
Yeah, yeah. Very good.
We need to go back to table 12 for the ballot paper.
Table 12 for the ballot paper, yes. I overlooked that, sorry.
The members at the table have 3 suggestions for the ballot paper. First, should there be a cut-off point for opinion polls being published prior to the election? In terms of allocation of funding, is there any possibility of funding being capped and making it equal across the board so that there's 50-50 funding to the pro side and the against side? And then the point is raised about establishing a permanent electoral commission with authority over all elections, not just referendums.
Yes, yes. Is there any cap? What was the first question?
Oh, in relation to opinion polls?
Yeah, yeah.
No, there's not, and it's an interesting argument. Funny, as a journalist and as someone with the Referendum Commission, I've been on both sides of this argument. It's funny that the journalist's argument tends to be we should be free to publish whatever we like, whenever we like, and no one should stop us. The other argument is that publishing a decisive outcome, for example, of an opinion poll a day before a referendum may well discourage people from voting or create a bandwagon effect and so on. The other argument is the political parties are doing their own opinion polls. The campaigners are doing their own opinion polls. They know the outcome. They know what the public are thinking. Why should they know and the rest of us not? Is the other argument that's made. So, it is an interesting...
The broadcasters are limited in
Yes, they by
previous day, is
by
it?
convention.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry, they do have a moratorium day, the day
Yeah,
before
yeah,
polling
yes,
day.
yeah.
They don't do coverage on the yes and
Yeah.
no side, and they
Yeah.
don't do opinion polls.
Yeah.
But I don't think they're legally precluded from doing opinion polls up until then.
Right.
But there is no doubt there are referendums that an opinion poll has landed the day before the referendum and has hugely deflated one side or the other, and arguably had an influence on the actual outcome. But the point is, just because that's happened doesn't mean it should be stopped, because the political parties and the campaigners know the results of their own polls anyway, and why shouldn't everybody else?
I'm sorry, what was the second question?
The second question,
It was just about a permanent electoral commission.
what? A
Just
permanent electoral commission. Yeah.
What was the second question from that table again? What
Yeah.
was the,
This is table 12. What was your second question? Yeah.
The second question was about making funding equal across the board, 50-50 to both the in favour side and the against side.
Yeah.
So, I mean, looking at the McKenna judgment, my reading of it would be that the McKenna judgment would not preclude equal funding. Now, I don't know, it may be that other people would say it precludes any public funding, but that wouldn't be my reading. To my mind, the problem that the court had in McKenna and subsequently in McChrystal was that it was favouring one side entirely. So I don't think there would be any constitutional barrier to providing equal funding on either side in that manner. Now, another version you see in some countries is where the funding is provided on some sort of proportionate basis, so it wouldn't be necessarily 50-50, it would be calculated in some other way based on, for example, political parties holding certain numbers of seats and so on. I probably would feel that the McKenna principle would preclude that model in Ireland. I think it would probably, if you were going to go down the public funding route, it would have to be on a 50-50 basis.
Yeah. That would be my reading of McKenna as well, actually. Yeah. Yes, we're table 13.
Judge, I'm the facilitator for table 13. The citizens at this table don't have a question for the panel. However, they have 4 suggested questions for the ballot paper. Why do we feel the need to review the process? Should it be maintained as is? Second question, is there an easier, more cost-effective way of holding referendums? Third question, should there be an elected commission in charge? And the last question, should we review the current law of no limit on spending and limits on donations?
Yeah. I think all of those matters have been covered, yes. Yes. Yes, table 14, is it?
Thank you, Judge. I'm the facilitator for table 14, and there was a question here for Dr. O'Mahony, and it's in relation to the Referendum Commission. A member highlighted that they had read that some of their power had been removed, and they would like clarity on this and why it happened. And this relates to section 4 of your paper, and they'd just like some clarity on that and as to why it happened.
Yeah. So this was the function that the Referendum Commission previously had of setting out potential yes and no arguments. So rather than just providing information on what the proposed amendment was, they would actually say some of the arguments in favour of this amendment are X, Y, Z, and some of the arguments against this amendment are X, Y, Z. So that was a function that the Referendum Commission had for a number of referendums after first being established. It was removed in the gap in between the 2 Nice Treaty referendums. So Nice was voted on twice, it was defeated the first time and passed the second time, and it was in the gap in between those 2 campaigns that the legislation was amended to remove that function from the Commission. I mean, there are different reasons floating around as to why that was done. You heard earlier on this morning, Niamh Hyland mentioned the idea that the arguments being presented in this kind of abstract way by the Commission rather than by campaigners perhaps didn't work very well, that it was confusing potentially to voters. And other views would have been that potentially it was giving potentially weight to arguments, giving an element of official weight to arguments which perhaps weren't really seen as very strong arguments. So there are various reasons, but that's when it happened, and that's roughly why it happened. But other people may have other views on exactly what the motivation was behind that change. So the effect of it is that now the Commission no longer does that, and the Commission simply says this is what you were voting on, and no longer prompts people as to reasons why they might decide to vote yes or vote no. They leave it to the campaigners to fill in that space.
Yeah, can I add one brief thing there, because I know there has been talk of maybe discussing the issue of whether we should revert to that situation where the Commission put forward yes and no arguments. A number of the commissions I've been involved in have had recommendations in their own reports to say they wouldn't like the law changed to say this is what you must do in future, but they'd like the option of doing it, of putting forward the yes and no arguments. So if there's a very contentious, lively debate on something like same-sex marriage or the Eighth Amendment or divorce or an EU treaty where there are a lot of people on the yes and no side making cases, well then there's a healthy debate going on out there. But if there was a referendum, as there was a few years ago, on whether to set up a new court of appeal, a lot of people went to the polling station, there was another vote on that day, and said, I don't know, I have heard no argument in favour of it or against it, I haven't a clue, because there weren't people bothered enough to go out and make the argument. So in those cases, the Referendum Commission would like to say, well, in order to help you get your mind going on this, here are some arguments why we should do it, here are some arguments why we should not do it. So in other words, there is a halfway house between saying you must only lay out what you're voting on and you must give the yes and no arguments, which is the Commission might have the option to give the yes and no arguments in cases where there isn't a lively, healthy debate.
What do you think? Did I mention it? Maybe, I think so. Yeah.
Any? Yes, table 9.
Good afternoon. I'm the facilitator at table 9. The citizens at this table have 9 suggested questions for the ballot paper. I'm going to cover 8 of them, and one of the citizens will cover 1 of them.
Have you any questions first?
No questions. Right. So, suggested question 1: should private donations be banned? Suggested question 2: should there be a cap for private donations within the context of citizens' campaigns? Suggested question 3: should the time between signing of the bill and the vote be extended, and by how much? Suggested question 4: should the Referendum Commission have a watchdog role to correct misinformation? Suggested question 5: should there be a ban of public funding going to political groups and existing monies be directed to the Commission? Suggested question number 6: should the Referendum Commission have sole responsibility of public funding? Suggested question number 7: should there be a level playing field for all media? And suggested question number 8: should the Referendum Commission be combined with an Electoral Commission with enhanced powers, e.g. information provision? And I'm going to pass on to one of the citizens to clarify the 9th question.
Very good.
The point that I was wanted to cover was kind of a part question, part recommendation from the table. Excuse me. I was just wondering if the table speakers could comment on a suggestion whereby if the Commission had a website using online facilities in the instance of any given referendum, citizens could then ask in questions relating to the referendum motion. And the experts or whatever that's required for that particular, they answer them there. This would offer sort of a consolidated, respected source of information for people to get their questions answered, as opposed to people going onto social media and possibly dealing with misinformation and having an extremely difficult time trying to ascertain what's true and what's not true and getting their questions answered. And then that information could be collated, and the most popular ones could be either stuck on a leaflet going in through letterboxes or actually on the website. And then the most popular questions obviously would serve everyone and not just the original questioner. And in doing so, then it would engage with the electorate more and possibly serve the promotion of referendums to a greater extent than people trying to dig their own furrows as regards trying to find out what they should or shouldn't believe to determine what their vote should be.
Yes, Mark, they do have a website, don't they?
Yeah, we do have a website, and we have been doing more and more of that as the years have gone by. In fact, I remember the last referendum answering questions on Facebook, which is the first time the Commission ventured to do anything as brave as that. The problem is usually questions which are asked about if we vote for this referendum, will it mean X or Y? Very often, which is very frustrating for people, there isn't a straightforward black and white answer. Very often. So what happens is we get questions in, we have a phone line, people ring in, people email questions. On radio, the judge does interviews and is asked questions, and we usually get them in advance. And the Commission sits down 5 members and considers them and looks at them and says, what's our answer to this? And usually the answer isn't yes or no. Usually it's a few paragraphs of explanation and context and so on. So it takes time, it's clunky, it's cumbersome. But the Commission does do that. It does answer questions that come in over time, slowly, because it has to be slowly. And there's a question and answer section on the website, which gets longer and longer as the campaign goes by. At the end of the campaign, it's usually quite long, with a lot of questions and answers that have been asked. But unfortunately, as one judge who was chairing the Commission once said to me, unfortunately, I'm the chairman of the Referendum Commission, I'm not a contestant on Mastermind.
Oh, yeah,
They can't go on and answer 20 questions in 3 minutes. You know,
Well,
every one of them has to be considered carefully.
And they also have the day job.
And they also have a day job too.
I wasn't suggesting that every question under the sun gets answered. If you were able to collate them properly and you found that 375 people asked the same kind of question, then that merits an answer. And
Absolutely,
you direct your resources towards the most common type of question, and that would serve the greater good, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, absolutely, and they do that. And one thing we started doing is usually the chairman of the Referendum Commission does maybe 2 or 3 Morning Ireland interviews in the course of the campaign, and we will talk to RTE in advance, say, look, here are the 5 questions that have been coming into us again and again. Can we answer them? Can you ask us those? And we will answer them for you. You know, and that is done. It's slow, it's careful, because it has to be. The Commission has to be right and has to be correct. But they do a certain amount of it. It would be great to be able to do more.
Because there was a general consensus.
Do you have a view on that approach?
I think I would echo everything that Mark said on that. I think it's a resource issue as well, that the Commission, we have heard so many times over the years, often doesn't have the time and the resources that it would like to do its job as well as it could. So I think to make it work properly, you would probably need to resource the Commission a little bit better. But I think it's an interesting idea.
The point was made within the context of nearly everybody. I think everybody in the table was expressing a view that the role of the Commission the remit should be redefined and expanded greatly, and in doing so, the related resources would be increased, and that would serve to facilitate an FAQ type scenario to a greater extent.
Can I say one more thing? I won't hog any more time on this. If the Commission gets an answer wrong, they may well be in the High Court tomorrow. That's their problem all the time. One side or other will say, you said that, it's not true, you're biased, I'll bring it to the High Court, and they will spend a week there defending themselves. That's why, a very good reason, and for good reason, the Commission can't just answer things off the top of their head, or they will be challenged. So, you know, the reason for the conservatism, which people often criticise, is just that when they say something, it must be absolutely 100% right. Yes and no side can say what they like, the Commission can't.
Yes, yes. Very good. Table 14.
Thank you, Judge. I would just like to read the points that the citizens would like to pass back to the Secretariat. So some of the issues they would like to see addressed in the ballot paper is guidelines for more than just broadcasting and media, possible rules and guidelines for social media. Information must be factual, and possible regulation was suggested. The Referendum Commission should be a permanent body and should be given the power to challenge the supply of information to ensure that it is factual. And it was also suggested by a member that a change in the day in which referendums are held should be addressed.
Thank you very much. And table 1.
Thank you. I'm the facilitator for table 1. Our table has a couple of questions, one of which has probably been answered already, and some suggestions for the ballot. First question was, what happens if a donation is received that is over the relevant limit, and the political party or third party refuses to hand it back or hand it over to the SIPOC, whatever. The second question was in relation to the Referendum Commission's function of setting out arguments for and against. I think that's been answered already.
Yeah.
With regard to suggestions for the ballot.
Well, we'll deal with the question, the remaining question first. Yeah.
So the position is if donations are accepted which are outside of the limits, then the position is that they must be returned. Must be handed over to SIPO as it happens within 14 days. So the organisation receiving the donation that contravenes the limits must notify SIPO and must remit the donation within 14 days. Failure to comply with that is an offence under the Act.
Yeah, and that is provided for in the Act.
Yes, that's set out clearly in the Act, so there are penalties accruing.
Yeah, very good. Yeah.
Okay. Just on the suggestions then, we felt that there should be the table felt there should be the same rules with respect to the 50-50 balance for both broadcast and print media as well. The Commission's should have powers of sanction if somebody deliberately issues false information in the run-up to a referendum. And also in relation to spending limits, we felt that that should be looked at, particularly where an organisation starts out before the referendum with a bank balance, a large bank balance already, and gives them a significant advantage over somebody starting from scratch. Thank you.
That last point sounds a little bit problematic, doesn't it?
Yes, I mean, it's a broad argument about politics everywhere. That do people with access to substantial sums of money come from a very narrow political outlook generally? And some people say they do. And therefore, does that narrow political outlook have a disproportionate influence on politics? That's a big societal issue.
It's a question of enforcement as well. It's a nice issue in principle to think we're going to regulate how people spend their private funds, but how you design that and how you make it work is a complicated
And also we have to bear in mind the right to private property in the Constitution.
And the right to free speech as well, indeed.
Very good. Any other table? Have I got a lot of views? Not many questions, but a lot of views. I'm very, very grateful to both Conor and Mark for their presentations and for dealing with the questions and giving us some observations on the suggestions of the members. Thank you very much. Show your appreciation.